Have you ever stood in front of a Sargent portrait and felt like the person could just step right out of frame and start talking to you? Like this painting of Lady Agnew. There's something about her eyes, that mouth, the way the light catches her skin that makes this painting feel impossibly alive. But if you've ever tried to capture that same lifelike quality in your own portraits and ended up with something that looks more like a wax figure than a living person, this video is for you. Because I'm going to break down the secret behind why Sargent's portraits feel so alive and real. And it's not what you would think. It's not about perfect anatomy. Sargent was known for just conveniently pretending that his sitters didn't have collarbones. And it's not about flawless color mixing either. It's about something much more subtle and also counterintuitive. His abstract brushwork and how he controls his edges. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why expressive brush marks aren't something great artists add on a whim. And you're going to better understand the formula for how and when to actually use those expressive brush marks. But if you want to reverse engineer how your favorite paintings play with brushwork, I've put together a free guide linked down in the description that walks you through exactly how to analyze edge relationships in your favorite paintings so that you can apply it to your own work. If you've ever looked at your own portrait and thought, why does this look so stiff? Or why does it feel like I am painting a statue instead of a person? Well, you're not alone. Most painters get trapped thinking that more detail equals more life. After all, the closest thing we've got to go off of is a photograph. And we think photographs look pretty dang lifelike, so naturally, we're gonna hold that up on a pedestal and aspire toward it. Most painters get trapped into thinking that more detail equals more life. So they tighten up their brushwork. They render every single eyelash, they make every edge crisp and defined, and somehow the painting dies in the process. And that's because we're approaching the painting the way a camera would. But Sargent doesn't see the subject the way that a camera does. He paints the way a human eye sees. Sargent's portraits don't feel alive because of every little detail he gives you. They feel alive because of what he actually doesn't show you and how he uses edges to trick your brain into filling in the gaps. Surprisingly, this is actually way more like how our eye experiences the world in real life. And he's using these tricks to great effect. So those tricks are exactly what I'm going to explain to you today. Now, I've spent years studying Sargent's work, creating master copies, discussing Sargent's technique in depth with other master painters, and what I've learned completely changed the way that I think about edges and brushwork. And I want to share that breakthrough with you. First and foremost, brushwork is not just this arbitrary, inborn thing. So Sargent's brushstrokes aren't just a stroke of luck. They may look improvised, but they are surprisingly intentional. So let's break down the brushwork that he employs into different categories so that you can better understand the method behind the madness. So I'm going to start with this Sargent portrait. Overall, when we look at this particular portrait of Lady Agnew, the overall impression is one of a great deal of softness. After all, there's kind of this haze to her hair. She has just a really overall gentle, subtle form to her face. There's nothing that looks jagged or garish here. And what that means is that the hard edge, those really crisp, defined edges where you can see very clearly exactly where one shape ends and another begins, well, they really stand out on this particular portrait. For me, my eye goes really quickly to the beautiful pendant that's hanging from her neck, but also the knotting on this gorgeous sash that's tied around her waist. But we also see some of the same firmness and edges in the sash as it falls down her side, as well as her face. And what this does is it really controls the way our eye moves around the painting. Sargent is really using these hard edges strategically. They wind up serving as anchors in the painting, so they tell your eye exactly what's happening in the most important areas. And notice how he places them in high contrast areas, so areas where you have a very light value against a very dark value. I think what stands out most to me would be areas such as the knot in the sash, or where the sash is falling down her side. We have these really deep shadows juxtaposed with this very delicate light value of the purple of this sash. And typically, it's areas where the contrast is highest, so maybe this one little shadow up here at the top, or some of the areas where these shadows are just starting as the sash falls down her side. That is where the edges tend to be the most crisp. And we can see this in areas like her face as well. For instance, this one edge that goes along the side of her face and neck, or even something like just this little tiny piece of hair that's falling just to the side of her ear. These areas of really naturally high contrast lend themselves to harder edges in general, but they aren't the only opportunity for a hard edge. Shiny materials like jewelry, like glasses, like a really wet, glistening eye. These tend to also really invite those sharp edges, and we see this implemented beautifully in the pendant that's sitting at her bosom. So already we have two instances where having a hard edge makes a lot of sense. Areas of high contrast in terms of value, areas where the material just happens to be really shiny. The next opportunity for a hard edge are places where the form turns really sharply. For instance, in her, well, at least in her portrait, I think this is really clearly exemplified by this edge along the left-hand side of the chair that she's sitting in. Now, the chair is painted in a way that's fairly organic. It's not overly stiff and mechanical. But what I notice when I take a look at this is that there's kind of a rectangular prism captured by the edge of this chair. And as it basically turns a 90-degree corner, this is where we get a fairly hard edge into this shadow shape. You might also notice this is another area where we have a relatively light value moving into a relatively dark value. And we actually see this happening on both sides of this shadow. We have it on the edge of the chair, and we also have it where the cushioning of the chair begins, just on the other side. But here's the key. Sargent is never putting hard edges everywhere. That is a recipe for making a painting feel like a photo. Instead, Sargent really saves them for the moments that matter, places where we really want to direct the eye. So as I take a look at this, my eye tends to bounce between the areas of high contrast in her face, and specifically, I would say some of the firmer edges along the brow, or maybe, again, this harder edge right along the side of her face. It might jump toward this edge of the chair, and then I might go back to the pendant, the details of the sash, the areas where this is echoed in the far arm off the edge of the chair, and then I might cycle back to her face. But if we're not repeating hard edge over and over again, we need to talk about other types of edges that Sargent is employing. So let's dive into soft edges. Now, let's take a look specifically at the transition between the forehead and the hair, or the hairline, or for instance, the area around the lips. See how these edges, they almost feel kind of pixelated in this image. It's really difficult to pinpoint exactly where the border between one shape and another exists. There's some kind of gradient, there's a gray area, so to speak. And that's because the edge is relatively soft compared to the really crisp, hard edges that we've been talking about earlier. So specifically, now look at the transition from the forehead into the hair. See how the edge here just really seems to breathe? The entire hairline feels really soft. You can see that there's a transition, but it's gentle, almost atmospheric. So Sargent is really using soft edges here to suggest a few different things. One would be a softer texture. And I would say a transition into a hairline is a perfect example of that. Compare that to a really shiny texture, like the jewel that we were discussing earlier. something that is a highly reflective material and that also has these really kind of crisp, jagged facets. By comparison, if we talk about a hairline, naturally, there's just going to be a little bit more noise. And so softening that edge is a really easy way to evoke that texture without getting out the one-haired brush and painting every teeny little detail in the hairline. This can also be a really great opportunity to explore things like different fabric textures. And we see this to great effect in the sleeves of this dress. We see soft edge after soft edge in here because he is depicting this really gauzy fabric. Similarly, soft edges are going to be great in areas where the form gently curves away, or just in areas where there's a transition between relatively similar values versus very high contrast value transitions that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to point out a couple of examples of this. For one, I can see that on the right-hand edge of her face, we do see her face going into shadow here. But the shadow is relatively light, and as a result, because these values are so similar, and also because the form is turning so gently, we have a relatively subtle gradient, a relatively soft edge transition between the area of light that we see here and the area of shadow as we progress toward her jaw. Finally, there's one other kind of secret for an opportunity to soften your edges, and that would be an area that either is already in motion or could set into motion really easily. And on our faces, in case it's not obvious as you watch me talking here, the part of our face that tends to be most mobile is indeed the mouth. Now, we are pretty expressive around our eyes, and we think about the eyes as capturing a lot of expression, but I don't actually talk out of my eyes. I need my mouth to do all of this heavy lifting so I can deliver this information to you. So, as you watch this, I hope you notice just how much my mouth moves compared to my eyes, and my eyes are moving even more than something like my nose or my ears. So what does this actually mean? Well, if we want to convey this lifelike feeling that the subject of a portrait could just spring into conversation at any moment, one way that we can really evoke that, and one way that Sargent evokes that beautifully, is in softening the edges of the lips when possible. To me, what stands out in this is that he really beautifully softens a lot of the edges of the lower lips, and I think as much as possible, he's avoiding getting too hard of an edge in the upper lip. I would say this is definitely harder of an edge than the lower lip, at least from the image that I can see here, but it's not overly crisp. And the reason why I point this out is that one of the most common beginner mistakes that I see in portraits, and I think this can really progress and stay with painters even as they are quite advanced in their portrait painting, is a tendency to create too hard of an edge around the lips. And what this functionally does is it makes your subject look like they're wearing really heavy lip liner. And usually that's one of those tells that makes this really feel not lifelike. So keeping these areas soft is really crucial for making your portraits feel alive. The lips are the most mobile part of the face. If you paint them with hard edges all the way around, it looks like your subject is wearing really heavy lipstick even when we're not. And Sargent clearly understood this and employed this in his painting of the lips. Even though there are some areas where the edges become somewhat hard, he's very careful to really balance that with softened edges as much as possible. Okay, so far we've covered hard edges and why those happen, as well as soft edges and why we might have those instead of a hard edge. But let's talk about the third type of edges, which is where I would say the real magic happens, and that is lost edges. Places where shapes completely meld into one another. In this Lady Agnew portrait, the lost edge that jumps out to me before anything else is actually this boundary between her hair and the cast shadow onto the wall behind her. Even though I instinctively know the edge of her hair is somewhere here, I really only know that because my brain can fill in the gaps. I understand, based on the shape of the left-hand edge of her hair, roughly what the shape should look like on the right-hand edge. And My brain is kind of like interpolating that information. But if you actually had me zoom in and like pinpoint the pixel where it stops being her hair and starts being the background, well, I probably couldn't really find it. It would just be an educated guess. This is where most painters get scared, myself included. We think we need to show everything to make it look lifelike. But Sargent understood that lost edges create unity between shapes of similar value. They allow the viewer's eye to rest. It forces the viewer to use their imagination, and it really makes adjacent edges that are harder by comparison more powerful, just by means of contrast. So when you're losing an edge, you're not being lazy. You're actually being really smart. You are letting the viewer's brain do the work of completing the form. And interestingly, this is actually how our brain works in real life most of the time. I learned something a while ago that really blew my mind. Typically, the area in which our brain sees in full focus tends to be about the size of our thumb stretched out in front of us. Now, you might say, Chelsea, that doesn't make any sense. I have this entire room around me and I'm seeing it in full detail. But my understanding is that that's actually a trick that your brain is playing by having your eyes really rapidly jump around the scene. Our eyes stay still a lot less than we think that they do. And so oftentimes, your brain is actually filling in those gaps. And when we paint that way by losing our edges, we invite the viewer's brain to do the exact same thing. So even though there's technically less information, it actually feels much closer to what our eye experiences when we're navigating the world in everyday life. Here is what I discovered from taking these principles and these different types of edges and really studying Sargent's work. First things first, he never has too many of the same edge types in a row. So scrolling down here, let's take a look at this sash. And I'm going to start here let's just start on the left-hand edge. So we start with like a relatively crisp edge. I would say it definitely firms up as we come to this little juncture here. Then it transitions into what you could argue is either a soft or lost edge. I would say this is like right on the cusp, if only because there's this tiny little line indicating that that edge is still kind of there. Then we start to transition back into a hard edge as we work our way up. And then we have this like really interesting, beautiful passage where the edge softens again. We have a pop of it being crisp. We have a place where it totally merges into the dress. So we have this lost edge. We go back into a soft edge, and then we go into a hard edge. And we see this kind of repeated over and over throughout the painting. We can apply the same thing on the right-hand edge of the sash, where we have a hard edge, it softens, crisps back up, softens, crisps up, softens, hardens. We have a little moment of it being lost, soft, hard, soft, and then we go into a lost edge again. One painter who really stood out to me as far as being able to employ this so beautifully and really running with what Sargent is playing with here is Frances Bell. If you watched my channel before, you might have watched my video where I break down the incredible edges of her Draper Grand Prize winning portrait for Portrait Society of America this past year. What I love studying her work is that she has really set up the composition in a way that invites this rhythm of never having too many alternating hard and soft edges. There's this really beautiful cadence where, I don't know, there's just this organic rhythm of just when it starts to feel like there's a repeatable pattern of harder versus softer edges, she'll throw in a lost edge or she'll mix up the pattern in some other way. Specifically, I think this is really beautiful to study as we go up the silhouette of this particular portrait. We have a hard edge at the bottom of the sleeve. It softens. We have a moment of it being totally lost into this background. Then we start to reestablish the cast shadow between the sleeve and the background, and we have this soft edge. It firms up into a hard edge. She totally loses it here. Then we have a soft edge, then a completely lost edge as we have the top of the vest into this darker stripe on the wallpaper. We have what could have been a soft edge, but one that she intentionally obliterates here. as we go into this area where there's slightly more contrast. A really, really cool and interesting choice. This softened edge between the side of the neck and the wallpaper. A hard edge as the hair peeks out behind the neck. And this pattern essentially repeats all throughout the rest of this, where there's just never these broad passages where it's just hard and soft, hard and soft. She is intentionally interrupting with areas for lost edges. And it creates such a visually engaging portrait that when I saw this in person, I just wanted to stare at it for hours. And what I love about this is that it kind of feels like music. There's a rhythm to these kinds of edge patterns. The rhythm is what keeps the eye engaged and moving through the painting. It's what prevents your eye from getting stuck or your brain from becoming bored. When I finally understood this pattern, suddenly things really changed in my own work. I realized that putting down bold brush strokes wasn't just something that happened on a whim. It wasn't something that was coming from Sargent's unique genius, and it wasn't just a quirk of his personality. It was something that he was employing with a great deal of strategy and intention. And so in my own work, I really saw this help me to level up when I stopped trying to paint everything that I could see and started painting only what needed to be seen. I stopped making every edge the same and started conducting a symphony of edges in my own work. The result? My portraits finally started to breathe. They had life and not just accuracy. And I think that's really a huge reason why this particular portrait wound up winning the OPA gold medal, because by this point, I understood how to play with edges to the extent that I could create something like this that feels not just lifelike, it almost feels more real than life itself. If breaking free from tight, lifeless portraits like that is something that you're excited about, I've put together a free guide that walks you through exactly how to analyze edge relationships in master paintings and apply that analysis to your own work. You'll find the link in the description below. And if you're starting to practice this in your own paintings and you want the exact exercises that I use with my students to really explore your edges and get more creative in your brush strokes, I have a free masterclass linked in the description that you'll want to check out next. In it, I walk you through the step-by-step process for analyzing master paintings, and then I give you the specific practice exercises that you can do at the easel that will help you to develop your own edge control and expressive brushwork in your paintings. Remember, Sargent's portraits don't feel alive because he was born with some magical gift. They feel alive because he understood a system, a predictable, learnable system for controlling edges to create an image that really looks lifelike. And once you understand this system, you can start creating portraits that don't just look good, they feel alive. So don't wait until you're ready. Don't believe that you're just a tight painter by nature. Expressiveness isn't a matter of talent. It's simply a system. And when you follow it, you start creating work that stops people in their tracks. I can't wait to see what you create. And until next week's video, happy painting.